On behalf of Access, it is my privilege to welcome you all to the 15th Livelihoods India Summit. May I now invite Ms. Pooja Gaur to deliver the welcome address.
A very good morning, respected guests on the dais, Mr. Andrew Goodland, Program Leader for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, Dr. Yamini Atmavilas. On behalf of Access, it is my great honor to welcome the eminent dignitaries of the inaugural panel. I'm also privileged to extend a warm welcome to all the speakers, special guests, and delegates. Thank you very much for joining us for the 15th Livelihoods India Summit organized with Niti Aayog as co-host. 15 years ago, the summit started small when it was organized as an additional day at the Microfinance India Summit. Over the years, the summit has evolved into a national level convening aimed at building an ecosystem around promoting and supporting livelihoods, showcasing best practices, and promoting knowledge, seeking to address the pressing challenges and highlighting the transformative opportunities within India's livelihoods landscape. India's recent strides demonstrate the remarkable impact of inclusion and outcome oriented policy and execution. The economic resilience of the country, even in times of global uncertainties, is evident as it strives to become the world's third largest economy. India's multi-dimensional poverty decreased from 29% in 1314 to 11% in 2023, lifting 24 crore people above the poverty line. This progress is a critical component of India's ambitious Viksit Bharat vision, which envisions a developed India by 2047. In spite of this progress, the challenge of providing dignified, sustainable, and resilient livelihood opportunities to various segments of people remains complex. While rural livelihoods remain largely dependent on agriculture and allied sectors, with increasingly decreasing opportunities there, catalyzing non farm employment is a challenge that needs to be tackled. There's an emphasis on women led development. However, to build on this momentum and address persistent challenges, it is essential to examine the barriers that continue to hinder the full realization of women's economic potential in India. Climate change being an imminent reality, livelihoods need to be promoted in sustainable, ecologically positive frameworks. In keeping with this, businesses are looking at sustainable sourcing as a strategic business imperative, moving away from voluntary requirement. Gender responsive procurement and social procurement are emerging as levers for achieving the twin objectives of development and sustainability. These and many more topical themes that redefine livelihoods in India will be discussed as a part of the carefully curated sessions across the 2 days of the summit. As per tradition, the State of India's Livelihoods, the Soil Report, will be released at the inaugural, and Dr. Yamini Atmavilas, editor of the report, will present the summary. This year's special report delves deeper into women's economic empowerment as a powerful force driving national economic development. In addition, Access is excited to bring out the two other reports, Women Led Development, Locating Opportunities in the Non-Farm Sector, and Gender Responsive Public Procurement, that will be released across the 2 days. The presentation of the FPO Impact Awards, which is now in its 7th year, will be part of the valedictory session. Access has set up an investment fund on behalf of IFAD, which is called the Grants for Agroecology Program Fund, GAP Fund, for supporting enterprises operating in the agroecology value chain with grant funding and technical assistance to help them scale up. The grants to the latest cohort of grantees will be presented at the valedictory tomorrow. Winners of the Livelihoods India case study competition will also be felicitated, and the compendium of 10 best cases will be released at the valedictory session. Civil society organizations play a pivotal role in nation building, particularly in the context of India's socio-economic landscape. Following the success of its first edition in 2022, the Development Catalyst 2.0 will recognize the impactful work undertaken by CSOs in the area of economic empowerment through a special felicitation event that will be held this evening. Access and a few of our partners are organizing associated events and roundtables that offer an opportunity of closed door and more engaged conversations. Four such events on advancing women's entrepreneurship, diversified financial products for SHG women, locally led adaptation practices, and FPO acceleration will be organized across the 2 days. We are overwhelmed with the support from a wide range of stakeholders, sponsors, technical partners, knowledge partners, and sector leaders who contribute to the discussion in various panels across the 2 days, and a large number of delegates who attend the summit every year. We acknowledge and appreciate the support of all our sponsors and partners who continue to invest financial resources and intellectual resources at the summit. I hope that the knowledge shared through the summit sessions will contribute to research, practice, and further dialogue on the livelihoods of the vulnerable. I also hope that the summit will provide a common platform for policymakers and practitioners. Once again, I welcome you all and wish you an enriching experience across the 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gore, for your welcome address and this brief introduction to this year's summit. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to the release of State of India's Livelihood Report 2024 edition. The State of India's Livelihood Report is an annual publication addressing the contemporary issues emerging in the livelihood sector. It is the only document that aggregates the experiences and challenges of the sector, analyzes case studies, and reports on the progress of both the government and the privately run programs. The State of India Livelihoods Report, now in its 17th edition, continues its legacy as a definitive report documenting the trends, challenges, and opportunities in India's livelihoods landscape. Each edition brings a unique lens to pressing issues, and this year we are very proud to dedicate the report to the transformative theme of women's economic empowerment, inspired by the Honorable Prime Minister's vision for women led development. The report has been edited by Dr. Yamini Atmavilas. May I request Mr. Dheeraj Mutreja from Rabobank Foundation to please join us on the stage for the report release. May I also request Sachi Bhalla from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to also join us on the stage. And may I also take the pleasure of requesting Mr. Vipin Sharma, CEO Access, to please join us on the stage for the report release. May I request the report to be brought forth on the stage, please. May I request Mr. Brij Mohan to please join us on the stage as well. May I now request Mr. Andrew Goodland to please release this year's State of India Livelihoods Report. We congratulate everyone who has worked hard for the accomplishment of this humongous task. Thank you all for joining us on stage to do the honors. May I now request Dr. Yamini Atmavilas to share key highlights from the State of India's Livelihood Report on behalf of Access and the authors.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this was it's a cliched term, but this has been a labor, blood, sweat, and tears, and a labor of love. And first of all, a big thanks to the Access team. I now know why you do what you do, but I have no idea how you all stay so calm with all of the authors and my sort of what I call nakras of just getting this all together. A huge, huge thank you and appreciation for Pooja and the team that brings this out, and their intrepid leader Vipin, who just manages to keep calm in many, many turbulent waters. So thank you so much. I want to start with an acknowledgement of that. I was very excited to sort of look at the theme of women's economic empowerment for two reasons. One, the challenge of finding the differentiator. I think the last couple of years, we've had a lot of conversations and the live discussions on what women's economic empowerment is, what directions it needs to take. I think the ecosystem has been a buzz with this, maybe an overuse of this term. And so, really sort of figuring out, okay, what can we do with a report, a really critical vehicle like this that can carry a message and a call to action? What are the differentiators that one can bring in was a first challenge. And a second was bringing in fresh perspectives and fresh sort of thinking into the space, given a lot of the intellectual capital that exists and has already been engaged in this. Um, and when it comes to gender equality, women's economic empowerment, I think we have also the maybe a challenge and the blessing of multiple stakeholders, multiple sectoral priorities, and multiple narratives that might be possible, and finally multiple inspirations that might drive us to do this work. I think it's we are in a good sort of place now where we can talk about climate and gender without having to explain it all. We can talk about gig economy, platform economy, and gender. We don't need to sort of reinvent the narratives of why gender is important. We may miss out on some of the details, but we're not having to sort of explain ourselves to enter the space. And I think it's with this sort of thinking that we went into doing this report. And I'll say maybe two things before I get into the chapters itself. One is figuring out what we need at this point in time as we look towards the SDGs and look towards the next 10 years of our work. A singular sort of question for me was, what is the narrative that one needs to take? Is it about gaps? Is it about opportunities? Or is it also a little bit about celebrating where we have come from all of the efforts that have gone before? And so, what you'll see in this report is a little bit of that strength based or appreciative based narrative, wanting to sort of see the glass as half full, not because it is so full. I think there is an empty half of that glass. But how do we inspire ourselves to keep doing what we're doing, to galvanize the momentum we are seeing into actual action and into investments that can come for the space? And so what you'll see is this kind of narrative of wanting to you'll see in the report a lot of assessments of what have we achieved so far, and a sense of opportunities of what we can do if we are able to sustain our momentum, and also the energy that we have for the space. And so the chapters themselves are ordered a certain way, but I'll sort of speak to maybe 4 buckets in which I sort of see them coming together. Um, the first, and can we use the slides or? Oh, I can drive it? Okay. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Great. So, I mean, I've done nothing on the slides other than just put the chapters and the names of the authors, because it'll be nice to sort of also celebrate the work. So I've sort of see these in terms of 4 buckets. One are just what I'm just calling base chapters that set the context and sort of give you some of the building blocks of this whole women's economic empowerment sort of thinking, the conceptual piece. A second piece is the second cluster for me are the policy chapters. A third, sort of bringing together discourses and conversations that happen in silos around employment and entrepreneurship, around labor and livelihoods. And so how do we bring those together? And the fourth is bringing business and philanthropy. So taking a little bit of a more ecosystem view and sort of seeing who are those critical stakeholders and how do we unlock some of the private sector financing and the private sector action in the space. So going back, you can stop looking at the slides. I don't have anything there, but I'd like to sort of speak to a little bit of highlights of each of these clusters. I think one of the big conversations we often have in the gender sector, and those of us who work on more gender sort of spaces, is this whole question of social norms. But the moment you bring social norms and gender norms into the mainstream, I think there is a bit of confusion on, is this something that will just prevent any change? And so I think we wanted to include a conversation around norms and economic empowerment to say, no, its norms change over time, but there are very specific ways in which norms influence women's economic empowerment and their ability to participate in the economy. And here are some ways in which they have been changing. And so, one of the contributions in this, the role of social norms and agency in influencing women's livelihoods, focuses on that. It focuses on what are the norms that constrain women's ability to participate. Some of them are the set of expectations, one that society and our communities have of women's roles. And second is the real ways in which women's time gets spent on activities that are not necessarily about the labor force. And that I think one of the biggest drivers of that is the unpaid care work and women's the constraints on women's time. And so, sort of talking about the way in which these kinds of norms and restrictions actually can either constrain, or when they start to change, they can enable and catalyze women's participation in the economy, is where this chapter sort of sits. And there are some really nice examples of, large scale government programs. I think there are ways in which we can design to actually change norms. And so one of the most interesting ones, of course, remain NRLM and NREGA, where you actually have the concept of Mahila mates and women leaders in federations. So you're actually positioning women as change makers and as transformative agents of change. Now, capacity needs to be built. You have to sort of figure how do you actually catalyze the presence of these mechanisms into actual change. But these programs in their design are thinking about women's leadership in these local communities. The other is, of course, the provision of creches that is built into Manrega's design. And so there are ways in which, again, the policy is an enabler program, the schemes are enablers. And so how I think in recent past we've sort of seen renewed efforts at making sure that you're able to pick up and solution for the creches within Manrega. So I think there are some really good examples of how these programs are in their design, without saying that they're going to change norms, are actually have analyzed our problems of women's participation and ability to take up the schemes, and therefore are addressing norms within their design. So I wanted to bring that especially into this chapter, into this issue. The second piece is on measuring women's employment, and thank you for actually including that in this, because I think it's such a critical data measurement is such a critical part of how we're able to build the narrative around women's work, what the gaps are, and what might be some ways in which one can overcome some of the gaps. And what you'll see in this chapter is a long discussion actually on what are some challenges in measuring women's work given the large informality of women's that characterizes women's work, and also this whole distinction. Now I think there's been a lot of preoccupation with thinking about what does self-employment mean, and that spectrum from self-employment to entrepreneurship is a big one. So how does government, how does the PLFS measure these things, and what might be some of the challenges in undercounting? And this is like something that has been, at least in the for feminist economists, 30-40 years sort of journey of influencing how national statistics take on board measurement of women's work, take on board understanding of the informal economy. And I think time use has been one of the biggest and most well-known vehicles of carrying that ambition. And so so you'll see a little bit of that, a good discussion on that. And maybe two more points on that before I move to the next cluster, which is identifying measurement gaps is not sufficient. One has to sort of also see, okay, what else should we do? And so what you see in this chapter are really practical solutions and things that have been piloted on how do you measure differently. And there are two critical things that matter. One, who's answering these questions? And so are we asking the women, or are we asking the proxies? Are we asking the right proxies? And what the authors found in their own work is that there is a gap of about 7 to 8% when the head of the household answers for what women do, and women themselves respond to what they do. And so that is already like a big chunk of how one can actually fix this without radically transforming our measurement systems. The second is what we ask. And so can we, I think time use is a really useful vehicle, but it's a very, very expensive and difficult one to repeat very often. And one doesn't need to repeat it very often. But it gave us the first round that was piloted in 1997 gave us a real understanding of the informality and women's participation in informal work and household work. So the recent one similarly does that and gives you a really quantified way of understanding it. But in normal surveys, how do we measure this? And this is not just for government surveys, but our own impact evaluations. How are we understanding change? And how are we understanding women's participation? So there's a whole set of recommendations around that. And one of the primary ones is don't ask them in terms of principal and secondary categories, ask them in terms of a list of activities. Do your initial understanding to understand what women do in that particular sort of segment you're going into, and then ask them activity by activity, and then the difference in the reporting is massive. So you actually get a real understanding. So I think there are some very practical ways in which recommendations here that are not just for the national surveys, but certainly for our own measurement systems for women's economic empowerment. The next bucket, my favorite, are the policy chapters. And here, again, we have a pretty vast sort of landscaping of women's economic empowerment policies. And it was, I think, a 60,000 word chapter that first came to us that we then had to head it down and say, okay, let's focus on maybe the top 10 programs. But very interestingly, again, bringing in a gender analysis of policies, not just do policies work for women, but how do policies work for women and address gender gaps? Are they gender responsive, gender intentional? What exactly do they catalyze? And how do they build in agency? Do they build in women's participation? And so, really going deep into sort of gender frameworks to assess policy is the strength of this particular chapter. And there are recommendations there. And while we've done much better, we are doing much better now on gender disaggregated data. I think we still have a long way to go to understand even differentiations between women within the category of women, like trying to understand different impact of different groups, participation of different groups. The second one, again, is no need for explaining it, but looking at the livelihoods missions, urban and rural. And I think for one of the few chapters that I've read, that sort of tries to bring together urban and rural into a similar framework, understanding that there are vast differences between the two contexts, but really trying to see how and what are the national livelihood missions, what have they achieved so far, carefully sort of stitching together evidence that's available to see how they impact not only what they were set out to do, but actually also impacting women communities and gender equality. And I think we come away with a sense that the livelihoods missions have moved far beyond, and we should no longer think of them as just livelihood finance programs, because of the multidimensional nature of those programs and the multidimensional change that they're able to actually catalyze into the for rural communities. The last one is on climate change, agriculture, and gender. I think we were trying to figure out how do we bring in climate change in a big way, but also ground it in very, very specific sort of parts of women's work. And agriculture seemed like the most salient for now. And I hope that in future chapters, we will actually be able to bring in more perspectives. But again, Dr. Manjula carefully reviews not just the literature on agriculture, women, and climate, but also some of these national policy vehicles, such as the Action Plan for Climate Change, the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, and really tries to sort of see how and where women are positioned within it, how well they are doing, and what needs to be done to close that gap, so that women are then positioned as key actors in the transition to the green economy that's underway. The third sort of bucket is on bringing livelihoods and labor together. And here we've taken a different turn in terms of entrepreneurship and, brought an analysis together that looks at India in the context of the global economies and tries to position like, what actually is working in terms of, and what have been the trends in terms of women's entrepreneurship in India, and how has that worked, and not. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, if you were to sort of remember one thing, it's that women hire other women, and so the entrepreneurship and employment worlds sort of come together here for us. And therefore, sort of seeing entrepreneurship as an employment generator and an employment accelerator is a very critical shift in our thinking that we need to make, because otherwise, I think in our practice, they are two very different sort of solution sets that we look at. The second sort of big piece there is something that is not known, I mean, not unknown to this crowd, but focus on women do set up, if not enterprises, they do sort of set up their own, whatever it may be, some kind of self enterprise, self own account work, as we call it, which captures a large bucket of things. So women are entering labor markets and they're exiting. They're entering, they're engaging, starting small businesses, small activities. Maybe they're not big enough to be called a business, or they're not ready to be called um, an enterprise, but they're doing it, and they're resourceful, and they're finding ways to enter. But it's the growth that is the problem, and it's the stabilizing of these enterprises. And I think, therefore, sort of bringing that to a policy sort of conversation is a critical sort of need to continue to sort of meet and continue to sort of push at, to see how do you scale and help women's enterprises scale so that they can also then create employment for other women. The next chapter, I think, a new entrant into this space is the livelihood space conversation is the care economy. And I think, again, we know that care economy can be a what we call in some ways double duty intervention, which basically can solve for the unpaid work care burden on women, but also create work for other women given the hyper feminized nature of the care economy. So, health workers, domestic workers, service, a lot of service care services are largely met by women, but in very, very unorganized and precarious ways, and with no sort of, with very limited policy frameworks and very limited market frameworks that are able to actually create dignified work in this. So, a huge opportunity here again to take the care economy solutioning forward, but in a way that one could tie together entrepreneurship and employment. And finally, the last bucket is how are we bringing business and philanthropy together. And Pooja spoke a little bit about social procurement being a really critical lever that private sector can use and can sort of scale in opening up their supply chains to women's businesses. And I think this is one of the most critical levers, given how much we talk about challenges of market access for women. The nature of women's businesses, the scale of number of micro and less than micro, nano businesses of women, and the need to access markets. I think this is a gap that is huge, and that cannot be met through exposing women more and more to market forces. I think the volatility will just has had very, very negative consequences. And therefore, how do you create some of these assured markets without distorting them, or maybe distorting them in the short term for a particular till a particular critical mass is achieved? This is very important. And so, and there are some great examples in the chapter on companies that have done this and done this well in India and globally. And the second sort of corollary to that is, of course, the I think India is unique in having a assured sort of quota for women in government procurement, which is very, very actually, the market size of that is huge, and the enablers are all there in place. I think India has one of the most sophisticated sort of portals, the GEM portal for procurement. There's been, I think, world's third largest sort of transactions are happening there. So a lot of exciting. The building blocks are all there. For us, it's about figuring out how do you make sure that women are able to plug into those systems and actually able to leverage them for the income enhancement that we seek. So the last chapter on this is on the philanthropy side of things. So how do we actually um, um, how do you leverage the financing ecosystem, because somebody has to then bring in resources to actually help make this whole ecosystem work. And a real call to action here is that philanthropy should sort of invest in ecosystem enablement and not only vertical sort of programming. And how can we also bring in more and more diverse kinds of philanthropic capital into the space? I think we all talk about innovative finance, but there's also patient capital that's needed, that needs to also become more innovative and come from very diverse sources. And so I'm happy that we were able to bring together a private sector in a meaningful way. At least this is a beginning, and I hope that all of these will actually spark off some good conversations between us. And the authors are here, I believe. I don't know if they're all here, but may I ask them to just stand up so we can at least thank them? Great, thank you. On that note, I will close and hand it back to Pooja. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yamini, for helping bring the report together and for this crisp presentation, bringing together the key points from across the chapters. And of course, we join you in thanking all the authors for their contribution in putting together this very well researched report. Thank you once again. And now it's time for us to hear from our esteemed chief guest of this morning's inaugural session. I now take the pleasure of inviting Mr. Andrew Goodland to deliver the keynote address. Please welcome with an applause.
Fellow panelists, Pooja, Dr. Yamini, friends, ladies, gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this launch of this summit. Not my first summit, and it's a real pleasure to be back here again. This has become such an important feature of the annual livelihoods discussion in India, an opportunity to come together to reflect, an opportunity to think, to learn new, fresh perspectives, and ultimately to progress on some of the critical issues facing rural India. And I think, congratulations to Dr. Yamini and all the authors on putting out the latest report. I mean, what I hear from the table of contents there, it's both looking at some of the old challenges, measurement, but also looking at and acknowledging that the space is evolving, and some of these new issues on philanthropy, on public procurement, on the role of the care economy. I mean, these are new set of issues which we have to confront, and so this event is so valuable in bringing us all together to think about it. And the World Bank is very proud to be associated with this event, as we have been for several years. And of course, we're very proud of our long-term association with the government of India and its rural livelihoods program, which now stretches back more than 20 years. And of course, over this time period, we've witnessed remarkable change. We heard some of the declines in poverty, the impressive growth of the country. And yet, as we gather here today and tomorrow, we acknowledge that the complex challenges remain for rural India and the economy more broadly. And we need to acknowledge this and, again, open our minds to thinking about how we address these challenges. The reality is that over 65% of India's population is still rural. While progress has been made, there's still much to be done. The goal we keep in mind is the prosperity of rural India and how this links to the broader economy. While we've seen increases in the level of female labor force participation, which just 10, 15 years ago was below 20% and is now up to close to 40%, it still means that nearly 60% of rural women and youth are not engaged in the labour market. So our task is to think about how we accelerate economic growth, but economic growth that is inclusive, reaching the most vulnerable segments of society. The journey towards Viksit Bharat is therefore not just about economic aspiration, but it's a commitment to the inclusion of all people, particularly those who remain on the margins, many of whom are in our rural settings. As we've seen, one of the most effective ways to achieve this is by strengthening rural community platforms. And we all know in this room the numbers. The numbers are incredibly impressive. 100 million women now are members of self-help groups. So the foundations are in place. But these institutions can become even more powerful drivers of economic transformation, including through increased integration of digital technology, including through developing more inclusive financial products and enhancing their connection with local government structures. I think we'll all agree that the key concept we're talking about here is women-led development. No nation can truly develop if half of its population remains underserved. Empowering women is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. Not least as we know that women reinvest their incomes in the community, leading to more sustainable and long-term growth. And so you get these multipliers that Dr. Yamini was mentioning. When you create women entrepreneurs, they employ more women, and you get more of a snowballing effect. So we must ensure that women are positioned at the forefront of rural development, are empowered to take the lead in transforming rural India. Just to mention the MSME sector, which is clearly vital. The sector holds tremendous opportunity for future growth and for job creation. However, we also know that enterprises face persistent challenges, including the limited access to credit, a lack of market linkages, insufficient training and technical capacity. To unlock their potential, we need targeted strategies, including tailored financial products. We need to simplify some of the regulatory processes that reduce the complexity of starting, running, and growing businesses. We need to recognize and facilitate the power of networks. For example, by establishing MSME hubs within rural and peri-urban clusters, we can facilitate better connection, knowledge sharing, and collaboration among local entrepreneurs. In addition, capacity building programs that focus on entrepreneurship development, digital literacy, agriculture innovation can equip rural entrepreneurs with the skills needed to take their businesses to the next level. Agriculture, the core of India's rural economy, must also evolve beyond the traditional food source and become a key driver of economic growth. Embracing sustainable farming practices, climate resilient agriculture can increase productivity and improve the livelihoods of millions of farmers, such as through low methane rice, precision farming techniques, and agroforestry. We must also make concerted efforts to increase value addition from agriculture. And I hope this summit will deliberate on the potential of the food processing industry and how this can be stimulated and modernized. India processes just 10% of its agricultural produce currently, which is way below what we see in comparative countries like China and Brazil. With higher incomes in the economy, changing diets, and a huge potential for agriculture exports, this sector has immense growth and job creation potential. To support these transformations, it's imperative, therefore, that we encourage private investments coming into value chains, such as warehousing, cold storage, transport, processing. These are essential and underpin agricultural businesses to reduce waste, to enhance value addition. Inclusive financial products targeting agribusiness can support enterprise in scaling up these operations. And of course, this is always one of the themes of this conference, is how we do leverage private finance, but also other sources such as philanthropic. While we anticipate job creation through these efforts, we must also be mindful of our approach to skilling. Labour faces a pressing challenge in aligning the growing demand for skilled labour with market needs, especially in rural areas where access to formal education and training remains limited. To build a more adaptable workforce, it's essential to strengthen the link between education and employment through vocational training, apprenticeships, and certification programs. Plus, we need to align educational curricula with emerging sectors to ensure that youth are prepared for future job markets. This shift from traditional to market-oriented skill development is certainly the need of the hour. And finally, as we push the frontiers of growth, inclusive innovation must be at the core of our development strategy. At the World Bank, the recently published World Development Report 2024 highlights the importance of the 3 I's: investment, infusion, and innovation, with the role of technology and innovation in empowering micro-enterprises, particularly in the digital gig economy, cannot be overstated. So friends, ladies and gentlemen, the path to a resilient and inclusive India requires collaboration and shared commitment, coming together as we are here to share knowledge, to create new ideas, to push ourselves to think differently is how we can succeed. I thank again and congratulate the organizers of this summit, and I'm confident that discussions over the next 2 days will be useful and valuable for rural India. My very best wishes for the success of this event. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goodland, for this inspiring address covering inclusive development and India's unique goals and challenges. With this, we come to the end of the inaugural of this 2-day summit. But before that, we would like to present a small token as a memento to our esteemed guests. We thank Mr. Goodland. Thank you, sir. Our thanks to Dr. Yamini Atmavilas. Thank you, ma'am. I once again take this opportunity to thank the esteemed guests who are present with us on the days. And once again, a very warm welcome to all of you who are present in such strength and numbers here. In addition to hosting the sessions, the summit has features like Livelihoods India Share Fair. The 17th Livelihoods India report that has just been released is available in soft and hard copy. You may pick it up from the Access Help Desk, which is outside. So here we are with a very packed schedule for the rest of the day, enriching deliberations on a diversity of issues relating to livelihoods of the poor. So we will now begin with the opening plenary. May I request the esteemed dignitaries to please take their seats back amongst the audience. May I request you all to please kindly remain seated